Well, good morning and welcome to all of you. I guess I should say good afternoon too, because we have some friends joining us from Northern Ireland. But thank you for participating in today's event. We're very honored to have Ambassador Mulvaney here, who is the US government's special envoy to Northern Ireland. Before we get started, for those of you who maybe don't, I think everyone knows me, but I'm Susan Elliott, and I'm the president and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And again, thank you to everyone for participating today. One of the things that I would like to say is, for those of you who don't know, is, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy has been very involved and very interested in Northern Ireland, the Irish peace process, and our chairman of the board, Bill Flynn, back in the 1990s, helped to get that process started that led to the Good Friday Agreement. So, and of course, I'm very interested because I used to be the Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland. So it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, as well as to many of our members. And I'd also just like to mention that today's event is co-sponsored with Yale University's program on peace and development, and we have the director of that, Bonnie Weir, and the deputy director, Hira Jaffe, on the call today. We are going to have a series of events focused on Northern Ireland and Brexit and the peace process, and we'll be letting people know as we get those scheduled. So, and I'd also like to recognize Elizabeth Trudeau, who I think is on the call, and of course she is the US Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland. So I'd like to introduce, although I don't think Ambassador Mulvaney needs much introduction, he currently serves as the US Special Envoy for Northern Ireland, but he previously served as the White House Chief of Staff for President Trump, and also as the director of the Office of OMB, Office of Management and Budget. And before that, he was a member of the House of Representatives from the 5th District, I think it is, in South Carolina. So he's got a very long and distinguished career in the US government. And thank you, Ambassador Mulvaney, for that. And especially thank you for being director of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. I can't even say the name, but to me, that's probably one of the hardest jobs in the US government. And you did a great job leading that office. So, and the other little tidbit I will say, because we have a lot of Irish Americans on the call, is Ambassador Mulvaney's grandparents hail from County Mayo in Ireland. So today what we'd like to do, I'm going to turn it over to the ambassador, but what I'd like to do is tell you that he recently took a trip to the region. He was in Dublin, Belfast, and London. And I hope that Ambassador Mulvaney, you can kind of give us a readout of your trip and tell us, you give us your impressions of, the state of play in the region. So welcome, Ambassador Mulvaney.
Thanks, Ambassador Elliott. Susan, thank you for having me. Yeah, thanks for the nice comments about OMB, the best job that no one's ever heard about, and we'd like it like that. The 5th District of South Carolina, by the way, for those of you who watch political shows on television, is Frank Underwood's district from House of Cards. So that is actually the seat that I represented for 6 years. Anyway, so yeah, thanks for having me today. I want to talk a little bit about the trip and about the lay of the land as I've sort of found it to be over the course of the last 6 months. Of course, I've only made one trip, unfortunately. Been trying for several months to get over there. Was hoping to be over there about once a month, at least a couple days a month. I believe very strongly in face-to-face diplomacy as opposed to stuff over the phone. But obviously COVID intervened, as did some unfortunate circumstances over there. The first time I had actually scheduled to go was about a week after the Story funeral in Belfast. Yeah. And of course, at that time, breaking protocols sort of moved to the top of the media's interest list, and having me come over and not quarantined, which would have been legal, but probably not politically very aware, simply didn't work out. And then second time I was scheduled to go over in the Republic, they had what I think they now refer to as Golfgate, where a bunch of elected officials also broke protocols and for the same reason had to cancel. So I finally made it over. I believe it was the end of September, though I have to admit during campaign season here, my schedule is sort of, I have trouble keeping track of the schedule. but I did finally make it over, and I went for a couple of different reasons, a bunch of different reasons, but two of them were driven in large part by the developments of the internal markets bill that Her Majesty's government had introduced. I believe it was sometime in mid-September. Caught me a little bit off balance. As I just talked to Brandon Lewis a couple days before it was introduced, didn't ask the question if it was going to break international law. So I was a little surprised by the answer, but I had a good chance to talk with Brandon, not only before, but then immediately after. And my immediate response to it was, okay, I know how the legislative process works. I understand how safety net legislation works. I also understand how the interaction of various agreements work. And so the attitude that I brought to the table on that as I went over was to sort of, okay, well, we're not going to set our hair on fire about the internal markets bill. I'm not going to assume that it automatically undermines the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, but I will certainly be aware of its potential to do so. And I wanted to talk to folks about that. And related to that, I wanted to talk about primarily what I referred to as an accidental border. I think everybody, rightly so, and I believe them, and I'll talk more about that in some detail if you'd like to, but everyone says that they don't want a border across the island of Ireland. That's the British, the Irish, and the Europeans. And I believe all of them when they say that, but I was also worried that it might happen by accident. And in fact, I asked the same question of just about everybody I met. And over the course of my week there, I did 2 days in Dublin, 3 in Belfast, and 2 in London. Had a chance to meet with all the major players, leaders of all the parties, with the exception of Labour in the UK, which I'll remedy on my next trip. But I asked them all pretty much the same question, which is, help me understand this potential domino fall, which is that for whatever reason, there's a no deal Brexit. And for that reason, the flow of goods from, say, Belfast to Dublin would cross an international trade border. The British certainly are not going to put up a border. I get that. The Irish, I believe, would not want to put up a border. That would leave the Europeans with a situation where a good can flow from London to Belfast to Dublin that is not consistent with whatever EU regulations there are or tariffs. How would the Europeans react? And my fear was that Europeans would simply go and say, well, we're going to have to put a ring around the entire island of Ireland, which of course would put the Irish, the Republic of Ireland, at a great disadvantage. And there'd be more pressure then to come back and put a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And it was that sort of, there was other permutations of that, but that's sort of accidental. No one wants a border, but at the end of the day, you de facto have one. To a man and a woman, they all assured me that they were aware of that and they were working hard against it, and that there were ways out of that box. The best example I got, again, was from Simon Coveney, who said, Mick, we're all aware of it. And at the end of the day, the Europeans know there's many more levers they can pull to bring influence, to bring pressure to bear on the British than the border across the island of Ireland. He specifically mentioned civil aviation. And the Europeans said the same thing. And then the British actually said the same thing as well. So I get the impression that as much attention as the interaction between a no deal Brexit and the border of Ireland gets in public, and rightly so, it doesn't seem to be the first place that the practicalities will take us if we get down that road. Importantly, that ties into the other issue I raised, which is, would we start down that road? Because what triggers that is a no deal Brexit. And I left my trip cautiously optimistic that there was going to be a deal. And the way I explain it is that, and I've used to have these conversations with the president all the time. I remember when we were in the government shutdown, the president asked me one day, he goes, Mick, do you think we'll get a deal this week? And I said, yeah, Mr. President, we'll have a deal by Friday. And he said, why do you say it like that? Why do you have such confidence? I said, Mr. President, and he and I used to both, again, buy and sell real estate. I said, do you ever knock on a door in somebody's house and say, hi, I want to buy your property for $1 million? And they look at you and they say, young man, my family's been here for 400 years. My great grandparents are buried in the backyard. I'm never selling this land. And then other times you'll knock on the front door and say, hi, I'd like to buy your land for $1 million. And they say, nah, I don't want to sell it, but I'll sell it to you for $2 million. The second of those examples is you're likely to get a deal because both buyers and sellers are sort of moving in the same direction. The first one, very, very difficult to get to a deal. I liken what's happening between the British and the Europeans right now as to the second, which is to say, I believe, after meeting with all of them, that they each perceive it to be in their own best interests to get a deal. And once I think you get over that hurdle, it makes things more likely to move towards an agreement. I think I can prove it to you, which is that despite the fact that the Internal Markets Bill, and rightly so, got a lot of attention and did bother a bunch of people in Europe and in the Republic, and in Northern Ireland for that matter, the Europeans didn't leave the negotiating table. And when the Europeans threatened and started the process for their lawsuit, the British didn't leave the table. I think there's been a couple of times where Her Majesty's government has come in and said they were going to stop talking, but they always would go back and talk the next 24 hours. So discussions have continued despite sort of the public protestations. And I'm not diminishing the public protestations. I'm just saying that despite that, conversations have continued. So I'm still cautiously optimistic. I've shared this with the Secretary of State, the President, that there will be some sort of deal at the end of the year. Now, that being said, it may well be a streamlined deal. The center of gravity seemed to be, in my discussions with the folks over there, that there'd be a deal on the flow of goods between Great Britain and Ireland, specifically Northern Ireland and Ireland. And also some deals on state aid and fishing, which always came up in conversation. I'm aware of that. We have our similar sort of analogies in American politics of things that are just, they're not that big a deal in the greater scheme of things, but they're a huge deal politically. And fishing is to the Europeans what, say, corn is to the United States. So that being said, if a skinny deal like that is reached, it does address many pieces, not all, many pieces of the interrelationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic, the flow of goods, for example, if it's addressed. Curiously, when I asked everybody, again, I asked them pretty much the same questions. Was the flow of goods really that big a deal? There's not that much of it. There's just not that much stuff that flows from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and then down into the Republic. And if it changed dramatically, it would stand out like a sore thumb. It would seem that this is the ideal place for technology to sort of make sure there's no smuggling and there's no abuse of the system. And there's really, are we overblowing the issue of the flow of goods? And everybody said, oh yeah, this is not about really the flow of goods. It is, but it's really about state aid. That's what this is about. It's about what the British government will do in order to subsidize various industries, businesses in Northern Ireland, would give them a competitive advantage over, say, their Irish or their European competitors. The last thing that I'll talk about, we talk about a bunch of things. I also talk to folks about legacy issues. We talked about a bunch of things, but I'll end on this, which is that I asked a question at the end of each meeting. I said, look, I have been told that if this is done properly, that Northern Ireland will be uniquely situated of all of countries, all the regions in the world, which is that they will have unfettered access to the British market, UK market, and unfettered access to the European market. Is that a reasonable goal? Is that a reasonable possible conclusion? Everybody said it was, and it was their goal to get that. One of the lasting impressions I got was that the Europeans especially seem to perceive Northern Ireland as something special. It was described to me by one person as a success story amongst all of the internal difficulties they've had in Europe, and they don't want to screw it up. They recognize the impact that economic hardship has on the social cohesion there, and they want to make sure that Northern Ireland is successful. And yes, everyone's working towards a situation where Northern Ireland, alone in the world, will be able to have access to both of those markets in a relatively, if not completely, unfettered manner. So that was encouraging that everybody seemed to be working towards that. Yes, there's a lot of bad blood over Brexit, and I get that, and it's impacting the EU-UK discussions. It may have, if it goes wrong, it could flow over into the UK-US discussions. We haven't talked about that yet. We can if you like. But one of the senses I took was that folks are working very hard not to penalize Northern Ireland for whatever other acrimony might exist, and that folks are interested in seeing Northern Ireland succeed, and that was encouraging. So with that, I apologize for talking too long. I'm talking 15 or 20 minutes, but Susan, do you want to take some questions, or you're on mute? Susan, you're muted.
I'm muted, sorry. We do have a question or two, but I'd just like to ask you, because you mentioned sort of the US-UK trade deal, and how would you say, how are we thinking about how that might affect Northern Ireland, or are we thinking about? Sounds like from what you said, you and the president are thinking about that, and just wondered, what effect that that our deal would have on Northern Ireland.
I'm in regular communication. Richie Neal is a friend of mine from when I was in the House. We have a good relationship. The four folks I talk to, by the way, are mostly in the House. Senate, I'll talk a little bit to Wicker, a little bit to Cotton, but for the most part, I'll talk to the House members because they seem to be just as engaged in it as anybody. So it's Representative Neal and Brendan Boyle on the Democrat side. Another friend of mine. We were in the Irish Centenary Caucus together. In fact, we were the two of us were the Centenary Caucus. And then Peter King and David Joyce on the other side. So I'm in regular communication with them. I did talk to Richie about his letter, both before and after. It's been talked to his office since I got back a couple of times. And I thought the letter was fine. I thought the letter was fine. And I told people over there that the letter was entirely consistent with the administration's position. The only difference was a difference in assumption of where we were in the timeline. Richie's letter seemed to assume, or I think you could argue that it assumed, that the internal markets bill had already damaged the Good Friday Agreement, even though it said, if then. The tone was the internal markets bill by its simple existence damages the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. My attitude was, I know how legislation works. So does Richie. Don't get me wrong. In fact, he knows more than I do. But I'm not willing to say it's already damaged. If it does damage the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, then yes, absolutely. Representative Neal and the administration will be on the same page. If Brexit damages the Good Friday Agreement and undermines the stability that it has helped bring in, that absolutely impacts a US-UK agreement. And to folks in my own party who say, well, why are you agreeing with Richie Neal? I'm like, look, even if I didn't agree with him philosophically, which I do in this particular circumstance, the House would have to approve any US-UK agreement anyway under Trade Promotion Authority. So you might as well listen to what he has to say, because he's the Ways and Means chairman, who's going to have a lot to say over whether or not a future US-UK deal gets dealt with. But no, I don't think you have to go to that practicality, because you can deal with the philosophy of it, the policy of it right now, which is that we are heavily invested. I don't like to use the term that we're a guarantor of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, because we're not. I've actually heard a couple of members of Congress say we're signatories to it. Clearly, we are not, but we are heavily invested in it. We are interested third parties, and we committed a lot of our energy and time to make it succeed, as did the British and the Irish and Sinn Féin and the Unionists. Everybody did that, and everybody's vested in seeing it succeed. So we will protect it, even though I don't like to use that term guarantor. And if that is violated, then yeah, I think it invariably will have an impact on the US-UK discussions, and I think it should.
Yeah, and I think that's great for a lot of our members, to hear, because I think we are, no matter what the term, but many of us are invested in making sure the Good Friday Agreement isn't damaged, because it's a success in a conflict, and it is what has led to the stability and security of the region. And we do have, going back to when you were talking about the border, have a question from one of the audience, and it's you mentioned about you were concerned about the accidental border if Northern Ireland Protocol stands, regardless of any trade deal, and they wondered why. Do you think that it will, it will be Ireland that will put up, a border, or or what? What are your thoughts on that?
Now, when I went over, again, I think it's important to skip to the end on this particular point. Say that I'm not as concerned about it as I was when I went over, but when I began the conversations, I was concerned that it would actually the Brits wouldn't do it because they know what it would mean. Mm-hmm. The Irish wouldn't do it because they know what it would mean. And the Europeans would start to put pressure on everybody to do it, because my fear was they didn't understand or didn't fully grasp what that would mean. And a little bit more detail on that. I had told folks that, look, I mean, we've had 20 years of relative peace now in Northern Ireland. If you're an Irish lawmaker or a British lawmaker, it is still lived history to you, even if you're fairly young. You still remember watching the TV. If you're in your mid-30s, you were in your teens and you maybe watched it on TV. But if you're a European lawmaker and you're in your 30s or early 40s, it's probably learned history, not lived history. And maybe it doesn't have the same gravity. And maybe you're more likely to push for a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, just because you don't have that shared history. And I left not much less concerned about that. So again, I look at what everybody identifies as their self-interest. The British believe it's in their best interest not to have a border. The Irish believe the same. The Europeans believe the same. When you have that, I think the risk of an accidental border go down dramatically. Plus, add on to that the fact that there really isn't that much flow of goods. The dispute, the difficulties with the Internal Markets Bill, and with the discussions, the folks who don't like the Northern Irish Protocol, a lot of it has to do with state aid, which really isn't the flow of goods. It's the subsidization of business by government, particularly, and again, I hate to come back to this point, as it pertains to fishing, because every time they said state aid, the next word out of their mouth was fishing. So not to diminish those issues because they're critical, but it's not the same as a hard border. You can deal with state aid without a hard border. You can deal with fishing without a hard border. There's certain things it's easy to conceive of a good leaving Belfast and going to Dublin without having a check and having somebody go, no, wait a second, there's someplace we have to check that to make sure it's, for example, safe or it's paid the tariff. But the flow of goods didn't seem to be the central consideration or concern at the time.
And would you say, just because we've got some others who want to ask questions, but one more question from me on this is that, in the greater scheme of Brexit, what are your thoughts on, is this Northern Ireland border issue and the trade issue, is that the big sticky wicket in getting the final Brexit agreement, getting UK to leave the European Union? Or are there other things that are more important? Because it seems like, of course, we focus on, the Irish issue, but I'm just wondering if that's, from your point of view, if there are other more pressing issues, and if you think there will be, some kind of an agreement by, the deadline.
I think they work out state aid. A lot of other things fall. And it comes back that state aid, I've been using that term, that I think the Europeans have used the term level playing field. They want to make sure that the British abide by some of the same rules when it comes to things like state aid. Environment, I think, has come up from time to time as other European countries, because they make the argument, if we're going to give you special access, then you can't subsidize your companies because it gives a competitive advantage over ours. And the British response is, you're asking us to do something you don't ask your other free trade agreement partners to do. So that's sort of that level playing field, I think, has become not the issue, but certainly a central issue. Taxation, by the way, doesn't get a lot of attention. I can't believe that that's not being discussed. That if the Brits decide they want to lower their taxes to make it more attractive to foreign companies to set up shop over there, does that put the European countries at a disadvantage? So it's that level playing field that they share now that they might not share going forward after Brexit. So no, I thought that was one of the big pictures. I think the potential for Northern Irish border, the challenges there are real. It needs to be addressed, but I think the reason it gets so much attention is, number one, and let's not kid ourselves, it's what the Americans care about a lot more than state aid between British entities and German entities. And it's easier to understand, and it does bring with it that spectacular, in the formal sense of the word, that spectacular risk of civil unrest. And state aid doesn't get it. So it's one of those things that the media loves to talk about, politicians love to talk about. It's easy. It evokes strong emotions, and it's a big deal in the world's largest market, largest media market. So those three things together, I think, to elevate. Not saying it's not important, it is, but I think it's of outsized proportion in how we look at it, just because of those various factors.
Yeah. Well, we've got a question from Kevin Sullivan, and he wanted to unmute and ask you. And Kevin, he's kind of the head of our ad hoc group on the Good Friday Agreement. So, Kevin, if you want to unmute and ask Ambassador Mulvaney your question, please go ahead.
Good morning, Ambassador. Thanks very much for this conversation, for the conversation earlier with the ad hoc committee. Congressman Walsh and Morrison send you their best. My conversation kind of starts with the Internal Markets Bill. It's likely to be defeated in the House of Lords next week on the 9th. Be another message of disagreement with it. When Her Majesty's government put that bill forward, it caught the EU by surprise, caught the Irish by surprise, caught everyone by surprise. Speaker Pelosi, the chairman, and then the UK government seemed to be completely surprised by the ferocious reaction by all sides, saying, this is really not appropriate, breaks the international agreement, blah, blah, blah. So maybe it's a tactical decision by them. But it seems to me that it was a unilateral decision, and the Home Office and the British government keeps making unilateral decisions. As we talked earlier this week, they made a unilateral decision on the legacy issue to overturn the Stormont Agreement. You can go back 5 years. They made a unilateral decision on the DeSouza case. Emma's on this call on citizenship. And so there's an enormous effort has to be made to kind of overcome unilateral decisions and get their attention. So the question is, does the UK government, and especially the Home Office, have an extraordinary tin ear, or are they just, I know they love the kind of 19th century sovereignty language, and it's, Nigel's doing quite well with that. Is it just like they have a tin ear, or are really just marching on their own beat?
There's a couple different, thanks, Kevin, and it's good to see you again. There's a couple different ways to answer that. By the way, the toughest question I think I got when I was over there, I spoke to a think tank, the Policy Exchange, I think his name was, a center-right think tank in London. And they asked me a question is, are the Irish better at diplomacy than the British? And that's one of those questions that
trap question. That's a trap question for you, Ambassador.
Exactly. But I'll tell you the same thing I told them, which is, look, I don't know about all over the world. I'm just telling you the Irish are really good at it. There are. I mean, they punch above their weight. Everybody knows it. They're really, really good at it. Doesn't mean the British are bad at it. Just means the Irish are damn good at diplomacy. There's a reason this little tiny country got its way onto the Security Council this year. They're really good at making relationships and punching above their weight. I think that's the best way I've heard it described. So I don't mind the tough questions, Kevin. So here's the way I answer your question. I don't fault them necessarily for the internal markets bill. I don't think, put it this way, it's not fault, that's not the right term. I don't look at the IMB the same way I do as the Stormont House Agreement on legacy, and here's why. Once I got a chance to look at the internal markets bill, it made it very clear to me it was a contingent possibility. So while it looks like it's unilateral, we're doing X, Y, Z, if you actually look at the document, what it says is, if there is no deal and we get to the end of the year, then X. And of course, by that time, there would be no deal, right? So they have to have some way to govern their internal trade. I get that. I think they did a lousy job of talking to people about it beforehand. Again, I talked to Brandon Lewis that week, and he didn't explain it that same way to me. But it didn't rise to the same level in my mind as what they did on legacy, because in legacy they had a situation where they're still actively involved with these things, and to unilaterally change that at that point, I think it really rubbed the Irish, especially, the wrong way, maybe even more so than the IMB did, because the Stormont House thing it doesn't have an expiration, right? The IMB doesn't really have a start date unless there's a no deal Brexit, but right. Stormont House continues to go on. Plus legacy is obviously just as emotional and just as important as internal markets and so forth. So your point is well made. All I can tell you is that I'm trying hard to develop these relationships with the British. It's a lot harder over Zoom, as you know, but I've met Brandon now half a dozen times in London and Belfast and in Washington, D.C., even before I was Special Envoy. I had a chance to go over when I was in February, still Chief of Staff, and knew I was moving into this position at some point in the near future. So I feel like I've got a relationship with Brandon. I can call him anytime, and I do. I think he was surprised, to your point, at the reaction to the internal markets bill. And if I read between the lines, there's a politician telling us, oh, maybe we could have handled that one a little better. We didn't think it was going to be such a big deal. If we had done better than that, then we might have lowered the temperature very, very quickly. He, in fact, shared with me some ideas of other ways he would have answered the question other than, does it violate?
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, his point was just, and listen, his point, I mean, full disclosure, this is what he said. He said, look, the Germans violate it all the time. There's a procedure in place for what happens when a member of the European Union violates the rules, and everybody does it. I mean, they violate it on their, on their debt to GDP ratios. They do, and then there's a procedure involved for how you remedy that situation. What he says he should have said is, yes, but it's the same thing as everybody else does. But he didn't say that, and that's fine. Listen, I'm willing to give everybody the benefit of the doubt, because again, I think everybody's trying to pull in the same direction at this point. If I get a sense that changes, then obviously my attitude could change as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thanks, Kev.
Mr. Ambassador, we have a question now from one of our co-sponsors, Bonnie Weir. Bonnie, the first question I asked you about the border was hers, and she's going to unmute and follow up with another question. So go ahead, Bonnie.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Ambassador, for taking time to talk with us today. So my question is, it's on the heels of Kevin's question. He mentioned a number of unilateral decisions taken by the British government that affect the peace process in Northern Ireland. My question is, do you not think that the Internal Markets Bill does damage the Good Friday Belfast Agreement because it damages Britain's credibility as a good faith guarantor of that agreement? While the US is not a guarantor or signatory to the agreement, the British government certainly is. So on the heels of all of those unilateral decisions, even the willingness to break international law by the British government, doesn't that signal that we need to put some pressure on them to keep their word? The border question shouldn't even be a question if they stick to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which they negotiated and agreed to.
Yep.
So I guess I'm wondering, how is the role of Britain as a guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement?
Yeah,
how is that ensured given what they're doing now?
Yeah, it's an excellent point that it does, while the bill itself, the text of the bill does not necessarily impact the Good Friday Agreement because it's contingent. So if that contingency doesn't take place, then the bill is a nullity and it doesn't make any difference. So the bill has not harmed. Your question is well put, which is, does the fact that it was introduced somehow reduce the credibility of the British government? I think that's what this all may be about. And I think, again, if I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, which I'm willing to do at this point, that was inadvertent. That if they had thought it through, they would have introduced it in a different fashion. I think Richie's letter, which is why I thought the letter was extraordinarily well done, very well timed, very helpful to me, sort of got things back on track, which is to point out to people, look, even if this by itself, in its language doesn't affect the Good Friday Agreement, you've sort of pissed off the wrong people. Sorry about the language. And you got to fix that. I keep coming back to the fact, though, in all of my conversations, it's not just with Brenda. I had a chance to meet with my former colleague, my former counterpart, Sir Edward Lister, the Boris Johnson's chief of staff. Everybody I met with from the British government was aligned towards being aware about the risks of a border and not wanting to have it. So again, willing to give folks the benefit of the doubt at this point. But your point is well made. Does the credibility go down? Yes. Is it the type of credibility that can be regained? Yes. You break a deal, that's really hard to reestablish your credibility. You hint that you're moving towards possibly breaking a deal, that's something that can be fixed. And I think they're making efforts to do so. Obviously, we'll know in the next 30 to 45 days. I don't think anybody anticipates the US-UK deal being finalized by the end of the calendar year. I've not talked to the USTR's office recently, but last time I checked, it wasn't going to be done by the end of the calendar year. So, and certainly the House wouldn't take it up before we know what the status of Brexit is. So again, if your point is well made. You are not wrong. Judging by the whole universe of experiences and inputs that I had, given the fact I think there's going to be a deal, given the fact I think everybody wants a deal, given the fact that I think other folks think there's other levers that they can pull, I'm not willing to jump to the same conclusions that Richie was, that the damage was already done.
Thank you, Ambassador. If I may ask just a related follow-up question, do you think that the US has a role to play in trying to heal the relationship between Britain and Ireland as co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, which has been damaged by all this? Yeah.
I had a great conversation with, I've talked to Mitchell Reese and Richard Haas about the role of this job. And they both, in different words, expressed exactly that sentiment, which is that's what our job is. We're supposed to be friends with everybody, fair with everybody. And when folks are not acting appropriately, the folks who try and bring that to everybody's light, but also to be available to both sides to when they need to mend fences, that we can help do that. So I think that's the best articulation that you just made that I think I've heard in a long time, which is that we're there to help heal any damage to the Good Friday Agreement that may have been done. and again, I get the sense that both sides want that no one here wants the Good Friday Agreement to be undermined and to be negatively impacted. So no, yes, that is the role of the United States. I think that's much better than guarantor, much better than protector. We are a facilitator, maybe, just to make sure everybody moves in the right direction, and I think everybody wants to.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Having been the Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland, that's exactly the role that you need to play. So you're right on target with that. We have another question from a friend from Northern Ireland, Emma DeSouza. And so Emma, go ahead and unmute and ask your question. It's snowing here in New York. Oh no. I just looked out the window. Anyway, go ahead, Emma. Sorry to interrupt. I think you need to unmute. You're muted. Or at least we can't hear you. I don't know, Stephen, can you help her with it? Because it looks like you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. Can anyone else hear her? Emma, we can't hear you. So
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, now we can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Brilliant. So sorry about that. Technology and always having to adjust to Zoom meetings has been quite a journey, I'm sure, for many of us, and I have struggled with that too. It's lovely to join you this morning, Ambassador, and I want to thank you for your thoughts and contributions. It's great to hear your views on your recent trip to Ireland and the UK. I wanted to ask about your views on the provisions within the Internal Market Bill that relate to the European Charter of Human Rights, and what your view is on the divergence from the European Charter, because as you will know, the ECHR underpins the Good Friday Agreement. So any divergence or undermining of the ECHR is quite concerning to us here in Northern Ireland, and I wanted to get your views on that.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And that's one of the ones I don't know if I ever got a good answer to why that was in there. I'm sure there's an explanation, but I don't remember what it was, which means if either I didn't get one or I got one that didn't make sense to me. But no, that's a really, and that, by the way, that doesn't get a lot of attention. We focus so much on the flow of goods and state aid and so forth, but you're right, that the convention is part of the Good Friday Agreement that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's there. And if you take the position, and I think we would be right to do so, that every provision of the Good Friday Agreement is just as important as the next, then that's just as important as the lack of a border and so forth. And it's something that needs to be tracked. It's a good point. I don't know if I have a satisfactory answer for you because I'm not sure I got one, but we will continue to raise it. And as soon as I get a decent answer, I'll be happy to share it with everybody.
That sounds great. We have another question now, Ambassador, from Jen Frankola Crawford, and then we'll go back to Kevin has a follow-up question, but we'll let Jen go first and then back to you, Kevin.
Sure.
Hi, good morning, Ambassador. Thank you so much for your time today. I just peeked out my window too, and it is indeed snowing here in New York, so it's our first snowfall. My name is Jennifer.
Am I not supposed to show you that? Then is that
Oh,
sunny and 70 is not what you all want to see?
That's beautiful.
I point out to all my friends in New York, it's not a prison sentence. You are more than welcome to move south. But so we got sidetracked.
My name is Jennifer Frankola Crawford. I'm president of the Braham Law Society here in New York. And my question is about legacy. The British government had to be dragged back into court 2 weeks ago by the Finucane family to set a date to come to a determination on whether they would proceed to a full public inquiry as promised. And also this week, Westminster Committee released a report that was damning of the British government approach to legacy and their abandonment of their commitment to legislate within 100 days of the Stormont House. In January, Boris Johnson agreed to do this and then abandoned unilaterally in March. My question is, have you raised this issue with the British government, and how do you plan to get them to honor what they agreed to in January and to make good on their promise to the Finucane family?
Yeah, I did raise it. Thank you for the question. I did raise it. Keeping in mind that here's a couple of the answers that I got. And I did get answers on this that made some more sense. So I have more of an answer than I did for the previous question on the human rights issue, which was that the New Decade, New Approach, which is the one that set out the 100 days, was simply overtaken by COVID. And I believe that. That doesn't justify, we'll come back to the Finucane situation and the other cases in a second, But face it, everything has been put to the sideline during COVID. I've actually been very impressed with the way they've handled COVID in Northern Ireland. They've had a little bit of difficulty the last 3 or 4 weeks in terms of the spike in cases, but up to then they were one of the success stories around the world. And COVID was everything all of the time when it came to the devolved government. Now, let's talk about the Finucane case. I won't tell you who I met with because a lot of the meetings were in private, but I did meet with several victims and families and so forth. And we did get a chance to talk about the British commitment to it. Again, we are interested in that, but we were not, I think it's fair to say we were not as heavily invested in Stormont House Agreement as we were in the Good Friday Agreement. So I did not, the Good Friday Agreement was there on my list. And we talked obviously about legacy and the troubles in addition to that. The one takeaway I've got on the issue was my interest in the Canova project. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not. It's John Butcher's program. It's sort of a one-off right now, not one-off. They're dealing with a handful of cases right now, but it seems to be going extraordinarily well, knock on wood. That they have access to a bunch of records that other folks have not gotten into. I understand the British government is starting to push back on that. I've expressed to them my lack of understanding as to why they would push back. And for example, they say that the Canova project will unfairly prejudice the British government because the British government was the only one that kept records. And that sounds good on paper, but it's not the way it's played out in the real world. What Mr. Butcher has done, actually, the one case he and I discussed at length is a case of an IRA killing of one of its own, and using the documents the British government kept from the time to actually bring that case to some closure. Plus, I just don't buy the issue of political fallout on the current Conservative Party. If there were things in Washington, D.C. that made the Republicans look bad during the Nixon administration, I really don't think that would sort of harm the Trump administration. The same is true of the Johnson administration versus the Obama administration. People recognize the fact it's 40 and 50 years ago, if not longer. So I don't buy that political concern that if they do sort of open the doors and let everybody look at all the records and so forth, that it's going to be the current British government that suffers. So I will, again, the COVID does, in my mind, factor into this. But at the end of the day, I do think that there's general interest in seeing them pursue. I've also told them, by the way, I told them this, one of the best things I've heard was from a veteran of the Troubles, who was an older gentleman. And he said he thought it was really important that they deal with these issues before it becomes myth. And I said, what do you mean about that? And he said, well, Mick, right now this is real history. We people who know what happened, we're still alive. He said another 10, 15 years, 20 years from now, it will change. And myth is always harder to deal with than reality. And I know my staff is sick of hearing me say this, but I was in the car driving through South Carolina on the phone with this guy. We're on the phone for about an hour and a half. And I drove by, and there's a place on a freeway in South Carolina, a 20-foot by 30-foot Confederate flag that flies on a large pole over the freeway in South Carolina. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, he's right. That's what we're dealing with. We deal with myth now. We didn't deal with those issues when it was still living history. We've fallen into myth, and it's much harder to deal with myth. So at every chance I've had, I've encouraged the British especially, but all parties, to deal with it now while the people are still alive. And you can deal with it while it's lived history and not mythology. That's not a fully satisfied answer to your question, because I think what you'll take away from that is that I see the Stormont House Agreement as less of a central interest to the United States of America as I do the Good Friday Agreement. I hope that's not the message that you take away. But for a variety of reasons, we spent more time on Brexit and the Good Friday Agreement than we did on Stormont House.
Okay, well, thanks. And I think Kevin has another question. So go ahead, Kevin.
Mr. Ambassador, one more question.
Sure.
I think Elizabeth Trudeau, in a conversation with Ad Hoc, talked about the internal markets book. And one aspect she raised was that, in fact, the bill had a lot of it was clawing back devolution powers from all the other nations. And that will simply is concern about fragmentation of the United Kingdom and the concern about Scotland, edging away, the rise of the Scottish Nationalist Party. So in any of your conversations, were there any discussions about how Brexit may have led to greater fragmentation of the United Kingdom and what people were going to do about it other than try to claw back power to Westminster?
Yeah, we talked about it, Kevin, but it was not a central part of our discussions. And keep in mind, what's my role? My role is to represent the United States administration's policy on Northern Ireland and how the Brits deal with Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. While of interest to us, it's not a central focus. Those are, for example, I'll give you a different example, which is part of the IMB dealt with trade flow from Northern Ireland to the island of Great Britain. Okay, I got to be honest with you. That's none of our business. That's an internal issue to them. Now, granted, there could be a set of circumstances where that leads to this, and now it touches on the Good Friday Agreement. But generally speaking, trade within the United Kingdom is a domestic British matter. It's when it starts to cross borders and starts to touch on the Good Friday Agreement that it falls more in our purview and something that we have much more interest in. So that's not to diminish it again, because we did discuss it, but I was trying to be aware here that I was not trying to tell the British, nor do I think we should, how they're going to handle Scotland or how they're going to handle Wales or trade from GB to NI, from NI to GB. I understand what the other way, once it goes from London to Belfast, now it's got that issue of possibly crossing into the EU, crossing an international border, touching on the Good Friday Agreement. Now there we are. But I tried to be, somewhat deferential. That, if they had come in and said, "Look, Mick, we're interested in your free trade agreement with Europe because it touches on us," that I would understand. If they came in and said, "Mick, we don't understand why you're dealing, we don't understand your policy on trade between North and South Carolina during COVID," I'm going to tell you, yeah, that's fine. It's none of your business. So I don't want to be that cavalier about it. But that's sort of how that's sort of the background I took into those discussions.
Thanks very much.
And now, Ambassador, we have a question from John Connorton, who's one of the NCAFP's Board of Trustees and a great supporter of Ireland and the Irish peace process. So go ahead, John.
Thank you, Susan. Ambassador, thank you very much for being here. I heard you earlier this week at the Ad Hoc Committee, which I'm also a member of. I've been involved in Northern Ireland for 40 years, and I've dealt with almost all of your predecessors very closely. You clearly are a person who is quite knowledgeable. I was impressed by your presentation to the Ad Hoc Committee earlier this week, as well as today. I give you great credit for accessibility and willingness to dialogue with foreign policy people as well as people in Irish America. My experience with dealing with some of your predecessors is that the trust and credibility of the personal envoy is a very critical component of being a successful personal envoy. Secondly, the relationship with the president is also critical. And lastly is just the general credibility of the United States and in particular a presidential administration. I'd appreciate your comments about how the United States is viewed and the Trump administration is viewed in Ireland, in the UK, in the EU, because that really affects your ability, however talented you might be, and however knowledgeable you are, clearly, in terms of representing the government of the United States in various negotiations. So again, I thank you for being here and give you the floor to tell us anything you think about American credibility in the process.
That's a really good question. And I'm going to give a couple of different answers and see if I can provide any texture that is of interest, which is to start to say, on one hand, I think that this impression that the American reputation overseas has been damaged is overdone. Because I think, first of all, I do happen to think there's a bias against the president in the press in this country, but that's fine. That's my opinion. But more importantly, I think that when you travel the world, and I've been fortunate enough to be in, 10 or 15 different countries over the course of the last couple of years, everybody realizes that international affairs now are different. Brexit would not have happened 20 years ago. I mean, look, I think with Spain went 3 years without a government. Israel has had what, 4 or 5 elections. I've lost track after a while. Ireland is a situation where Sinn Féin is now, a significant player in the minority. Politics is different. International affairs is just different. That we're going through a period of time where looking at the world through the models of the 1980s and even the 1990s just doesn't provide as satisfying an answer. On the other hand, I think your point is extraordinarily well made. I think the president has, because the president is so personality driven, in certain circumstances, our international relations have suffered a little bit. He and President Macron in France just did not make the same kind of connection that the president did with, say, Shinzo Abe in Japan. I think I could make the case for you that the American reputation in Japan is better than it was 10 years ago. American reputation in Germany and France, probably not as good. So I think that point is fairly made, but I don't think it falls neatly into the sort of monolithic, everything is worse. Now, come back to the micro of my experience. Hasn't come up at all. Hasn't come up at all. All they care about is the fact that if need be, and I'm talking about the Irish, the Northern Irish, the folks in GB. If need be, I can call the president on my cell phone now, and he'll answer the phone. That's what they want. That's what they care about. Is that we take it seriously, that we respect and we do the special relationships that we have with both those folks. I mean, it's the mother country and the father country, for goodness sakes. You don't have, every time I say this, the Australians get upset. We don't have 2 stronger historical cultural relationships than we do with the UK and with the Republic of Ireland. And they want that to be reflected in the attention that we pay to these issues. So at the same time, in the last question, I said that, Brandon Lewis might tell me to go pound sand if I beat up on him on Scotland. At the same time, I think they are happy to know that we do pay close attention and that we want to cultivate the relationships that we have with those folks. And I've not found any hindrance at all in doing my work so far caused by any larger foreign policy decisions that the administration has made. So I'm aware of the issues you raised. You're not wrong. I think in some places it's more right than it is in others. But where I've come in, where I've dropped into this system, I've found no hesitation and no prejudice and no shortcomings at all.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ambassador Mulvaney. We just have a couple minutes left, and I have a question I think that has been on my mind. We talked about Brexit and the larger picture, but, having served and lived in Belfast, going back to the Stormont Agreement, we know even before Brexit that Stormont was suspended. And I know that you met with a lot of the political leaders while you were there. And maybe you could give us your thoughts or impressions on how is Stormont doing? How are they doing in terms of the devolved government? And do you think, they will continue? There won't be, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but that they'll continue on in a positive direction. Because I think that's extremely important.
Let me give you the optimistic point, which is where I'll come down, and then I'll add a little bit of flavor to that, which is I think that COVID, if you were looking for a silver lining, and you're never going to find a silver lining on something that's killed as many people as this has, so that's the wrong choice of words, but I'm clumsy with language sometimes, is that it has forced the devolved government to work together. They now have a common enemy, which is COVID. And I think they've had some tremendous successes. Again, the last couple of weeks have been tough, but over the summer especially, they were an example of a success story. And I could make the case, for example, when I was talking to business groups here, which I have done, that they should look to how countries and regions handle pandemics and making their decisions on where to invest overseas, because the Northern Irish have done better than the Chinese, better than the Indians, better than the Brazilians. And that going forward in the future, if you have the ability to deal with that, that's a competitive advantage. And I think that they've worked together more than they ever expected to do. Now, here's the texture to that, which is I asked a couple of them if they thought they'd be able to suspend that. And they themselves were not as optimistic as I was hoping they would be. Like, well, maybe, when this is over, we might go back to just, having the same difficulties we had before. But it's always nice to have a couple successes under your belt. It's nice to spend more time together, working together on stuff. mean, Peter Welch is a friend of mine. I think he's a member of the caucus. Peter's from Vermont. And Peter and I, he took Bernie Sanders' place in the House, for goodness sake. Bernie and I disagree on probably 90% of substantive issues, but on the 10% of issues that we worked on, which we chose to spend our time on, because it's always more fun than fighting, we got along extraordinarily well. I think that's what you've seen, at least the opportunity to experience in Belfast because of COVID, that they can work together, and you hope that they build on it. Am I being naive? Maybe. And if I wanted to make sure I wasn't being naive, I said, look, I think everybody knows it's going to be a challenge, and you can see the ripples of discontent even now. I think it was someone had to resign this morning or last night over the handling of some COVID money to our constituency office. So, I mean, there's issues, and it's still politics, and it's still Northern Ireland. So I don't think we can take, again, a metric or a model from someplace else and force it on the folks who live in this particular part of the world. But I do think it's better now than it was, say, at the beginning of this year. And certainly Stormont is up, it's running. I've met with the various ministers who are from the various parties, and everyone's talking to each other. Is it perfect? No. I have news for you. Neither is our system. So again, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish, but I do think that at the end of the day, that there might be some good that came from this in terms of how they function moving forward.
Well, Ambassador Mulvaney, we're out of time, but thank you for ending this on a positive note. And I'm really glad to hear you say that the parties are speaking to each other and Stormont is up and running. And I want to thank you again, not only for spending your time with us this morning, but for your service to the U.S. government, and especially for taking on the role of the Northern Ireland envoy, because it was empty for a while, and I think you've done a fantastic job. And thank you again for spending time with us and for all you do for not only the U.S., but for the island of Ireland. So thanks a lot.
Susan, thanks for having me. Y'all have a great weekend. And don't forget to vote if you haven't already. See you guys. Bye now.
Bye-bye.